I remember coming home every day after school and watching reruns of Happy Days. I'd watch it both in reruns and in original release. I thought Fonzie was kind of fun. Liked all the different characters, even when they brought on Joni and Chachi. But even as a kid, I remember watching the episode where Fonzie jumps a tank of sharks, thinking, man, this is fucking stupid.
This is Third Song In with Chris Derrickson and Tom Polachek.
It was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen, and he did not appear to be cool at all. It's ironic that that scene, which I remember watching live, became a term that we use to this day called jumping the shark. This episode is all about shows, songs, artists that have jumped the shark. I do remember that's not made up. I do remember that. It was like, man, that's dumb.
Like I think obviously nothing happens in a split second, or it wasn't one specific thing that made that show go off the rails. But
Right, right.
there were things. Fonzie had already become less cool and just kind of looked and did stupid things because they were just trying to make people laugh, and it was harder and harder to find new stuff, I think. But seeing him with a life jacket on over his leather jacket and black t-shirt,
Yeah.
with swimming trunks on, was absolutely the most ridiculous thing I think I had seen up to that point on TV. It's funny though, because obviously you're talking about Happy Days and him jumping the shark, because that's the phrase now. That's what you say if something was good and has kind of abruptly changed. And people if you go online and type in jump the shark, and any show, any kind of form of entertainment, as far as I'm concerned, somebody has an opinion as to the exact moment when the quality of the show changed and it was no longer worth watching. And I think it's really funny. When I was younger, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I listened to the Howard Stern show regularly. I listened to Stern before he went to satellite for probably 10 years or so. I would listen on my way to work. And I don't remember if it was when he went to satellite or just after, but he's got a regular on that show now. And I haven't listened to Stern in years, but John Hein was a regular on that show. He's a contributor, kind of a producer, I think. And he supposedly is the one who coined the term jump the shark based upon that Happy Days that Happy Days episode. He's used the term jump the shark, and I think he created a whole website where that's what he did. He tracked when shows jumped the shark, and he would generate. That's, I think, how he got the eye of Howard Stern. I think he was a guest initially, and then he ended up becoming a member of his crew there. But it's funny, before this episode, I Googled jump the shark and Howard Stern show because I couldn't remember the guy's name. And the first 5 entries under Google were talking about when the Howard Stern show jumped the shark. Like, it didn't even talk about John Hein as the inventor of the phrase, or the person who coined the phrase. It was all about how Howard Stern show sucks now, and here's why, and here's exactly when it happened. So it's funny, nobody can escape from that term. Someday I imagine you and I will jump the shark with Third Song In.
Is it possible to jump the shark before you start?
I think we jumped the shark like we were on water skis on episode 1. I actually think Happy Days jumped the shark when Fonzie started wearing black t-shirts instead of white t-shirts under his leather jacket. That's when I think it happened.
I could see that. I like to give Chachi credit for it.
Yeah, he didn't. I don't feel like he made it better.
Interestingly enough, what should have made it jump the shark was the introduction of Mork.
Yeah, you're right.
But that ended up being a spinoff that was quite popular and started to propel Robin Williams to fame.
That's true. Although I think that was black t-shirt phase for Fonzie, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. I'll have to go back and look at some screenshots.
Which one is it? Which really drove it? Was it the black t-shirt or Mork?
Or the alien? Yeah, I don't know.
Alien visiting the 1950s.
I don't remember how they explained that the Mork and Mindy show was set in contemporary times. You know?
Yeah. Oh, I
Uh,
think they must have, because he must have traveled to Earth. I wonder if he could time travel too.
Yeah,
We'll have
I
to
don't.
explore that for a future episode.
I mean, time travel would be an explanation, or maybe he just doesn't age. That might be an explanation,
Oh,
but I don't
yeah.
remember them explaining it.
I'll look and see if Google has an answer while we're doing the rest of our show.
So the phrase "jump the shark," I think, is used most often when talking about television. Pretty impossible, I think, for a movie to jump the shark. I think a movie either is good or not good or somewhere in between. But it'd be funny to say that a movie jumped the shark like halfway through. Although I guess that's true now that I think about it. Because you know what? Here's a film I think jumped the shark. I think Stripes jumped the shark
Hmm. During the movie?
during the film. When you watch Stripes, the first half of that movie is absolutely hilarious. When they're in boot camp and when it ends with the training thing or the where they're marching through the parade ground and they've created uh their own marching cadence and they're all they're basically all exhausted because they stayed up all night and then after that they pass and they send them to Europe, and that part of the movie is absolutely ridiculous. Like it's all a silly comedy, but it goes from being really funny and original to some kind. It's like it's a completely different movie after they graduate from boot camp. So I would say Stripes is an example of a movie that jumped the shark.
Nice work.
Thanks, man.
Is that an original thought?
I do not think so. I think people have talked about
Yeah.
how it's almost two different films, and the first half is good and the second half is bad. So I won't take credit for recognizing that. I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody say that it jumped the shark.
I like that thought. That's a nice new interpretation. And I can't think of any right now. But I think there are others like that where you're like entertained in the first half and it's almost like they don't know what else to do, but they have to make it at least 90 minutes or maybe 2 hours. And then the end of it is just garbage.
I
I'll
feel
think about
like
that, but I'm
Yeah, I feel like that probably happens in films that are really based more around a lead actor and that character than a story. In other words, they're like, this guy's hilarious. He can improvise, which is sure as hell was Bill Murray in Stripes and Harold Ramis, as far as that's concerned. So we'll just base it around these two guys and let them riff. And we won't really write a script. So at the end, we're like, hey, what if we had this, Army SUV, that kind of thing. There's just like craziness in based upon when that movie was written, they were probably all just high as hell and just kind of went off the rails because they were stoned. But I would imagine there are other movies. I'm thinking there's probably some Eddie Murphy movies that are like that are just based upon his sheer talent, which can carry you for about an hour, but maybe not two.
all right. Well, I need to think more about that one, but I don't have to think as hard about some of the TV shows that jumped the shark. So I know he came up with an tentative list. What are some of the ones that you feel like are perfect examples of this jumping the shark?
The one that I think thought of first is The Office, and I think that when Michael left, the character Michael left, Steve Carell left. I think that's when it jumped the shark. I don't think it was awful after that, and I think actually they had an amazing final two episodes of that show, and the finale is really kind of a tearjerker, and they brought it all home, so to speak. But when Michael left, there were some. It just wasn't as funny. They did their best, I think, but again, you got a character that was just the core of all of that. His kind of ridiculous office manager character really kept everybody I think grounded in that world. And when he was gone, I think it definitely dove in terms of quality.
I think similar, and I think I may have mentioned this on a previous episode that wasn't on Jumping the Shark, but that 70s show, the last season was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Eric had left the show. I'm pretty sure that Kelso had left the show, if not completely, mostly. And then they introduced his name is Randy. They introduced a new character,
Yeah.
Randy, and they failed to introduce another character. He started at the end of the previous season, and then he died, I think, in the first episode, he died almost right away. It's almost like they're like, he's not going to work. Let's kill his ass off. And then they introduced Randy, who was one of the most unlikable characters I've ever seen on television. And I did some research on it, like, was this just me? But he was so unlikable that he's not even on the cover. It's not a big deal anymore, but of the DVD for that season.
Oh yeah.
They basically tried to hide his presence. Sure, the guy might be nice enough, but man, that was an annoying season. And similar, I think, was I didn't watch all the way to the end, but Scrubs, didn't they basically replace everyone in that last season as well?
Yeah, that's another one I think we actually talked about a little bit. But I first of all, I think Scrubs is one of the best sitcoms of the last 20 years. But their final season, and it may have been final two seasons. I didn't look into it specifically, but they did. They lost characters. The final season for sure. JD, the guy who played JD, well, actually both the main stars, JD and Turk, they were on occasionally, but they completely changed the location of the show. They changed the kind of the premise of what they were there for. It was more med school now than a working hospital, and it was really, really unfunny. Like it was actively not funny in my opinion. And even when those guys would show up in guest appearances, they couldn't save it at that point. And I don't know if that was the very final season or whether it was the second to last season. I also think they may have jumped networks at that point. They may have gone to a streaming platform for the final season. I think they probably ran out of money, which is why those other guys weren't there for all the episodes, because I'm sure they couldn't pay them at that stage. But for a show that I loved, and I guess that's the same thing with Happy Days. I loved Happy Days when it was in its prime. And I guess maybe that's why Jumping the Shark is a thing, is because it's generally a beloved show that you're just like, I want to keep watching it, but they've earned loyalty, but not that much loyalty, I think.
And I'm throwing this one at you last minute because as we talk about characters leaving, this one didn't involve characters leaving. I've streamed it over the last couple of years and surprisingly liked it. And then I thought it sucked. But Castle, I don't know, with Nathan Fillion.
Nathan Fillion, yeah. I never watched that show.
Yeah. And I had no interest in watching it, but then I just sort of ran out of stuff to watch, and it may have been during COVID. And but it's this crime writer who gets involved with the police and helps solve crimes. I mean, it's an okay concept, and he ends up falling in love with this sort of hard ass female detective who becomes the captain. The last season is bizarre, where they marry, and then they're married, but then they don't live together. And I don't know if I'm letting this color my vision of it, but I read that those two actors hated each other, like despised each other. And I almost wonder if they had to sort of keep them apart, or away from at least any of the romantic scenes. And so I don't know. It was just
really,
it just seemed awkward. And I guess part of it is Fillion was accused of proposing that they kick her off the show for a final season. And then they decided to end up canceling the show altogether. So again, a lot of that is speculation, and maybe what I read has changed how I view it. But the last season just seems really odd and contrived, and it loses some of the charm of the earlier shows, because he's a very likable actor, I feel, and that's what sort of made the show.
Yeah, I love him as an actor. He's done great stuff, but he has recently. It seems like he gets into those kind of procedural, police or detective shows, which I don't generally watch, those hour-long dramas, because he's in. I just saw a commercial did you know the show The Rookie is still on the air? Like that's him. I think the premise of that show was that he was an older guy who went through the police academy. So he was like a middle-aged rookie on the police force, which I think is, again, I'm sure he could pull that off because he's just got a great presence on screen, and he can be that guy who's kind of, who isn't afraid to play somebody who doesn't know what the hell he's doing and just kind of blunders his way through stuff, but is also a heroic character. So I was like, oh, that's really cool. But I think that show's been on for like 6 years now. He's not even a rookie anymore. He's just an old cop, right? I saw that commercial. I thought, how is that show still on the air? The premise really only works for like 1 year, right? Then you're not a rookie anymore.
That's
so
funny.
I don't know if it jumped the shark or not because I never watched it, but I just saw that commercial.
We're saying that the premise has jumped the shark.
Yes,
who knows what the show has.
I think you're right. The The only other show that I would bring up that I can't say it jumped the shark in the same way because I can't point at a specific event or incident is the show MASH. Again, the TV show MASH, one of my all-time favorite shows. It has a special place in my heart. It really was a big part of my family's, weekly television viewing, and we would talk about it. And it was not just a comedy. There was a social commentary, and it was just a great cast. Everything about that show I love, and that show just outstayed its welcome. By the end of that show, they looked so old. Like the staff of this medical hospital, there's no way they would still be, they wouldn't have stayed the whole time. And of course, that's the joke, is that MASH lasted, I don't know, 5 years longer than the Korean War. I know it lasted much longer than the actual war that they were supposed to be in. And they just, Hawkeye looked old by the end of it. Hot Lips, she was probably in her early 30s or late 20s when the show started. I mean, by the time they finished, she was like 40 and still a beautiful woman, but she didn't look like, the girlish nurse. And to give them credit, they played them as if it was grinding them down. The war was getting to them. But all the silliness at the beginning of that show was really believable. And after a while, you're like, I just don't see this guy who looks like he's a 50-year-old doctor being the silly, ridiculous guy that Hawkeye was. So I think maybe most people might point to the death of Colonel Blake, who was the original commanding officer of that unit. It was such an emotional, touching episode. It was so well done. So the actual thing wasn't awful, and you couldn't tell from that the quality might go down, as opposed to Fonzie jumping a shark in his leather jacket. But I feel like some people might point to that because you just lost this great character, and they slowly started bleeding off characters like him. And I imagine that, someone, I'm sure if we looked it up, someone would say, it jumped the shark when this guy left or when that guy came on. But all I know is by the end of it, it wasn't really worth watching. Again, amazing finale, really well done finale, most watched TV show of all time when it came out and for years after. But there's certainly some point where they probably should have stopped making the show.
This will be my last one for TV shows. I'm not even sure it jumped the shark. I just hated the ending so much that I want to bitch about it, which was How I Met Your Mother. It was the dumbest ending in the history of TV shows. It made me hate the show. Like, I see reruns now and I watch it and I'm just annoyed with every character on there because it's such a dumb ending. So if a show can jump the shark at the very end, because I thought it was pretty solid through most of it, some really funny characters, although the lead character, now I see him as a whiny bitch because of the way it ended. Yeah. But it was a really good show until the very end. So.
Yeah, I didn't mind the finale of that show as much as obviously as you did. I thought that there was some logic to it. I know in general people think that it was poorly done, and you're right. I'm not sure if that counts. If you're jumping the shark into oblivion, like you jump the shark and then don't put out another episode, it's probably not jumping the shark. But I do think that, like a lot of sitcoms, I think the finale probably soured the rest of the show for a lot of people. And because I like that show too. I was a pretty regular watcher of that show. And I didn't mind the end as much as a lot of people did. But it certainly could have been better. No doubt about that.
I'm going to move us on to musical artists. As you said, this is mostly associated with TV shows because of the length of time and the fact that they almost all jump the shark before they're done. And I'm going to start out with one of the most blasphemous things I've ever said on this podcast, which is that Bob Seger jumped the shark.
Ooh,
and it probably happened with the Chevy commercial for Like a Rock. And it wasn't a bad song. Like, I didn't mind the song. And I think he's put out some decent material since. But it just that sort of will be my theme throughout this, which is when artists hit a point either of declining popularity where they need to sell their music, or rising popularity and they have to sell their music, that selling is what ends up, I find, often ruining good artists, either the front end and it wasn't even the back end of his career, but he was struggling, I think, to put out the same quality of music that he was. And it was so disappointing to watch that commercial. It was almost like, are you fucking kidding me, Bob?
Yeah.
I don't even know you well enough to call you Bob, even though I went on the backstage passes and got to see you. But so that's my biggest example.
Yeah, I think it's unfair to him. I actually agree with you 100%. But when he did that, stars didn't do that. Rock stars didn't do that.
Right.
And that's the problem is now, bands come out that way. That's how they get heard, and they have no qualms about basically, selling their artistic freedom to a product or a restaurant or whatever it may be. And unfortunately, I think he was pretty prescient about it. I think he opened the door for a lot of people because he was so well regarded and such a great artist, and he took so much shit for it. I think so other people don't have to now. But I would agree with you that seems to be when I lost interest in his music.
And there was definitely a decline in quality of albums too. I mean, he was hitting that softer, like we used to call it like adult music. I forget what they called it. But
like AOR, right?
Yeah, AOR.
Oriented
exactly.
rock. Yeah.
Right. And it was clearly designed to sell versus rocking. I mean, he had his early albums, his live albums were awesome. And I saw him live twice. Even as an older performer, he put on a hell of a show. But like you said, he I guess was a trailblazer and is paying the price. But in my mind, like you said, artists didn't do that at the time, and it seemed to be really selling out.
Well, he laid the groundwork, I think, for a band like U2 to completely sell out. But I would also say that to me, U2 kind of jumped the shark when they did that big Apple release. Remember when that whole thing that they were part of whatever version of the iPod was coming out. They were part of the whole advertising campaign, and they released their album as part of it. And I can remember the TV commercials where there was like the silhouettes dancing and the colors changing or whatever. But I got to say, after that, I didn't listen to U2 nearly as much. I mean, they probably put out 5 albums since then, and I can't say I've spent a lot of time listening to them. And that's probably the kind of a Bob Seger effect for me, that they jumped the shark because, I respected them a little bit more as artists. A band like that, I mean, I don't know why. They certainly didn't need the Apple money to keep performing and creating music. So that might be another example of a band.
And that makes me think about another band that did sort of a technology, they sort of, I don't know what word I'm trying to use. They tried to do something not revolutionary, but very different technologically, which was Bare Naked Ladies. I don't know if you even remember this, but that one album that they put out that I'm not going to remember the name of, but I went to go see that tour, and it was one of the better concerts I've seen. And then this was when streaming was starting to really take off. And they announced that they were going to release their next album, or at least some of the songs on it, in different tracks so that people could organize them in whatever way they wanted. Not tracks, but like, the guitar piece and the bass. They were going to release them as all sort of separate things, and then people could combine them in various ways. It was a interesting concept. I don't think I fully understood it, but I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wonder how that's going to play out. And then I don't remember that ever happening. And then I don't remember ever thinking about Bare Naked Ladies again. So I don't know if that.
So
I'll have to do a little more research on what they actually tried to do. But they went from an album that had to be a multi-platinum album to back to being a Canadian band. Sorry, Canada.
They'll go back to our Canada episode when that happens. So the other, we talked about films, and I don't think very many films in and of themselves jump the shark. We've got a couple of examples. I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. But I do think that there are directors who you could point to and say they've jumped the shark, that they made great work up to a certain point, and then just either because they were cashing in or because they kind of became creatively bankrupt or whatever you want to say. But I do think there are a couple directors. I think there are a couple franchises also, film franchises, that have jumped the shark. One of the directors that we've already talked about in a previous episode is M. Night Shyamalan. And I think most people would say that he jumped the shark relatively early in his career. He was, he burst onto the scene with The Sixth Sense, which I believe was his first feature. I'm not 100% sure. It might not be. If you look on IMDb, there's two movies that I guess they list him as director from 92 and then 98. So he directed some films that I'm not familiar with. Then he did The Sixth Sense, which catapulted him into fame and was just, I think, a phenomenal movie. And he made just a couple more movies. And then, as we talked about previously, I want to say that when he put out The Village in 2004, so only 5 years after The Sixth Sense, that's when it seemed like he decided to rely on a gimmick and just have a gimmick, a twist ending for every film. And I would say that for the next, probably 5 to 10 years, he put out a lot of films, but I don't think any of them was nearly the quality. And I kind of stopped caring about what he was doing.
Completely agree. And it was a major disappointment because that Sixth Sense was so good. I thought Unbreakable was solid and fun as well. And then, like you said, it became just waiting for the gimmick versus, moving on to something else.
Yeah, and I will say that I think he's salvaged his career a bit, later. And in fact, he did a couple sequels to Unbreakable that were set in that same universe where you kind of had superheroes and supervillains. It's kind of a comic book thing without being, over the top costumes and what have you. And those were fun to watch, but I think mainly because they were connected to that first really good film, Unbreakable. He did Split, which you didn't realize was a sequel until the very end. And then the movie Glass, which included a bunch of characters from Unbreakable as a full-on sequel. And they were fun to watch, but as I said, I think it was more by relation to his earlier period of good work, because he was still also putting out these kind of just twisty, semi-pseudo horror films. And part of it's probably because I'm not a big horror film fan in the first place. But I think if you go online, most people would say that it wasn't long after 2004 that he jumped the shark as a director. And then I was thinking about franchises too, because I think a lot of people would say that the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, jumped the shark. I'm still a full-on comic book guy. I love superheroes, so I still watch pretty much every Marvel movie. I don't watch all the DC movies, although truthfully, I think they're getting better. But in the MCU, I can point to a specific film where I thought, this may not be going the way I want to. And that was, there's a movie called Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And it was part of this, overarching kind of storyline, like when they had Thanos and what are the gems, the stones. That ended with the Avengers movie, the last Avengers movies we've seen. And then they went on to this other thing where they were exploring the multiverse, and there was a Spider-Man movie that did it, and there have been other films that have done that. But Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, I just didn't like and didn't think that it just didn't keep my attention, or I didn't find it to be as interesting or as exciting as the movies that had kind of wrapped up with the Avengers film, Endgame. But I also think part of the problem for me was that the director of that Doctor Strange movie was Sam Raimi, and that is very much a Sam Raimi film. And I do respect that Marvel will give lots of different directors an opportunity to give their take on stuff. So it may just be a diversion. I'm hopeful that they haven't jumped the shark, and that there's a new Captain America movie coming out, I think in 2025. They've kind of slowed down how many films that they're putting out on a regular basis, and I think that's probably a good thing, because I think people are also just getting burned out on it. But for me, if we look back and say they jumped the shark, it's going to be that Sam Raimi movie that did it for me.
And our audience will notice that you're talking more about the movies because I'm lucky to see one movie.
Yeah.
So the chances of me seeing a bunch of movies in a series decreases significantly as the series lengthens.
Yeah.
So I will make a comment leading into another one that you put on the list, which is the James Bond movies, which I don't disagree with, although I think it has a different trajectory than a lot of these, in that as they change actors, there's an opportunity for each actor to jump the shark as James Bond. I think Timothy Dalton jumped the shark before he even became James Bond. I thought that was a really bad decision. I really got into it again with Daniel Craig. I thought the first several that they made of his with him as James Bond were fantastic. They brought the edge back. And I'm gonna forget which one it was, but it's like maybe in the fourth. There's one that just seemed to start running out of ideas. It just seemed a little long and not confusing because they're not that confusing. But I've stopped watching, and I'm not. Have they replaced him? I don't.
They haven't. He apparently has stopped being James Bond. I don't think he's going to make any more films, but they haven't announced a replacement. And that seems like it's been going on for years now. They've been talking about who they might use to replace him. I agree with you. I'm not a big James Bond fan. I haven't, like I didn't love the Roger Moore movies or the Sean Connery movies, even though they were huge when we were kids. It was just for whatever reason I didn't get into them. I came back to that franchise, or came to it maybe, basically for the first time with Daniel Craig, because I thought those movies were really cool.
Yeah, that first one was fantastic. Almost, I love a really good origin story, and that was a really good one. So
that was Casino Royale, right? I think, which oddly, I think the very first James Bond movie ever made was Casino Royale, but it was even before Sean Connery. It's some actor who only played him the one time. So and I put that on the list because I didn't know if you could talk about that franchise as jumping the shark, because as you said, they just literally change everything. They'll change the actors, and probably they try to do it to anticipate, people kind of getting tired of a certain actor or whatever it may be. The last one I'll bring up, and I was never a fan of this franchise, but I want to say it was last summer. There was like a 4th of July weekend or something. I didn't have much to do, and I watched every Fast and Furious movie from the very first one through the most recent one. And they're fine. The first one wasn't good. The ones in the middle, I could see how it built up. All of a sudden, people started watching them because they changed it kind of completely. They all basically made it into a superhero franchise practically, because you really have to suspend your disbelief with that franchise. And I forgot to look it up, but as far as I'm concerned, having watched every single one of them back to back to back to back, I will tell you that I believe Fast and Furious jumped the shark when they drove a car into space. There's a scene where they shoot, and it's like I can't remember because I'm not that big a fan of the franchise, but it was like a Mustang or something, and they put it on a rocket and they shot it into space to go save somebody. It's the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen. I'm like, all right, I'll suspend disbelief, like, the best of them, but that was just way too much for me. I don't even remember what film it was. It wasn't the last one. It was like 2 or 3 movies ago, and they keep making them, but they just get more and more ridiculous. But if you can drive a car into space, it might be time to rethink the franchise, I think.
All right. I think that's if we don't stop, we're going to jump the shark on our discussion of jumping the shark, which will take us to our next segment, which is Tom's this week. This season 5, we introduced a new segment called Unknown Unknowns, where we highlight artists that are not just unknown, but really unknown, and we feel should be a little bit better appreciated and definitely better known. So Tom, what do you got for this week?
So my unknown unknown for this episode is a band that's near and dear to my heart called Devil in a Woodpile. They are a kind of old-timey blues band, acoustic band. Their lead singer and harmonica player is a former teacher of mine, which is probably the only reason I know about them in the first place. They're a lot of fun. They play in and around the Chicago area and have been doing so since the late 90s. I mean, they've been around now for like 25 years, and I, every once in a while, I check the Chicago Reader, and they're still playing. The last time they put out an album of original music was 2005. So I always wonder about an unknown to recommend when they're not even really generating new stuff. But I think this is a band that's worth listening to, especially if you like traditional blues music. They are a Bloodshot Records band. They've been on Bloodshot from the very beginning. My favorite album of theirs is their first album, which was just called Devil in a Woodpile. It came out in 1998. They have two other original albums, Division Street and In Your Lonesome Town. Then they put out a best of, which I didn't realize, but they put out a compilation in 2018, which is, I guess, the best songs from those three albums. Because as far as I know, they didn't put out anything else. I don't know of any EPs or anything like that. The harmonica player and primary singer is a guy named Rick Sheridan, who used to teach harmonica at Old Town School of Folk Music. He was one of my first teachers. Frankly, he's just kind of a cool guy. He's just a musician type of guy. I think he's also a teacher, as a matter of fact. I haven't seen Rick in probably 15 or 20 years at this point. I haven't seen them play live in quite a while. It may be that long since I've seen them. But if you live in the Chicago area and you see that they're playing somewhere, they're a lot of fun. They'll play with a stand-up bass sometimes. They'll play with a jug. It's not everybody's cup of tea. They on Spotify, they have 1,468 listeners or followers. I didn't check on the other streaming services, but my guess is probably a little bit less on those as well. And I think that's unfair. I think although when you listen to them, as I said, they feel very old timey. The songs they write are original, and or at least many of them are, and there's a contemporary feel to what they do. Rick's got this crazy, real deep voice that you wouldn't expect to come from that particular body. But they're just a lot of fun. I think they play with a lot of good humor, and they have a lot of fun when they play live. So I would recommend Devil in a Woodpile as my unknown for this episode.
And I remember you putting them on, I feel like one of our first playlists, like the ones we would mail back and forth to each other because we'd record them on cassettes.
Yep.
And just so you know, they have 122 followers on YouTube Music. So
yeah, that's what I figured. They deserve more than that. They may be a bit of an acquired taste, and it's certainly a band that I don't listen to every day. But every once in a while, that kind of music hits the spot, and they're as good at it as anybody I've seen live or on tape.
And I'm not as much of an aficionado as you are with blues music, but I do remember liking, I'm not going to remember the song because it's probably been 20 years now, but I did like that song quite a bit and was surprised because I don't always dive into the blues like you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they're worth listening. I'm happy to recommend them as an unknown. Which that now takes us, speaking of recommendations, to our pop culture recommendation for this episode. We are each going to make a recommendation for the year 1992. I'm going to start, and I'm going to recommend a book that was published in 1992. Truthfully, I probably didn't read it for a couple years after that. But when I saw it came out in that year, I can't help but recommend All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. He's one of my favorite American authors, one of my favorite authors, period. And All the Pretty Horses is probably my favorite book that he's written. It was the first one, so it may just be, that makes me remember it so fondly. But it is just an outstanding contemporary Western tale. When I say contemporary, I think it was actually set in like the 30s or 40s, but it's not an old timey 1860s type of Western. It's about two kids who live in Texas who cross the border and the adventures and romance and everything else they get into. But Cormac McCarthy, no one writes like him. He has this very spare, very authentic feel, particularly when he writes about the West, Texas, Mexico, those kind of things. And it's an unforgettable book. It's also one of the books that was turned into a film that I thought was really, really loyal to, I thought the film was really loyal to the novel. That was the one with Matt Damon played one of the lead characters. And I really felt like they did the book justice, and that's not always the case. And that's my 1992 recommendation, is All the Pretty Horses, the novel written by Cormac McCarthy.
I've never read it, and I feel like you must have read it when we were still living at least close to each other, because I remember you having the book. You must have read it pretty close to when it was released, because I distinctly remember you reading that. I was intrigued by it. I just never got around to reading it.
Yeah, that's the year I graduated from law school. So maybe I did pick it up close to when it was published. Now that you say that, that would make sense. That
Yeah.
maybe after graduation, maybe that period of time where we were still living together.
All right. I went with the movie, and it's actually a movie I've seen. So
Mhm.
we got that going for us. But I went with Clint Eastwood's, both as actor and director, 1992 movie, Unforgiven. And a couple reasons. I think it's a fantastic movie, but I'm not, I was never really a big Clint Eastwood fan. Like I didn't watch all of his Dirty Harry movies. I may have seen one of them, and it was long after it had come out. I very much like the outlaw Josie Wales, so I like him as that type of character. And to me, this seemed like a sequel to the outlaw Josie Wales, even though I'm not sure if it was intended as such, because he's an older, sort of beat down former lawman, and I think he does a great job of acting, which I can't say that I felt the same way in some of his earlier
Mhm.
movies. You can feel his fatigue, but also his anger and how he tracks down and ultimately deals with the bad guys in this. There's some really great scenes too. Like I love. Hopefully, hope it's perceived this way, but I thought they gave some power at the time to the women in the whorehouse who dealt with the guy who was an abuser, and he helped them out as well. Just a great take on you didn't see a lot of the older, at least I've not seen, so who knows, maybe there's a bunch of them, but the older lawman who's feels like he's at the end of it, but he gets this one last chance to make a difference. And I feel like Clint Eastwood embraced that as an actor in this movie, and it turned me into more of a Clint Eastwood fan. Still hasn't really turned me into a Western fan, but this was one of the better Westerns I've ever seen.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Not a fan of westerns, especially like the westerns from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And if Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is a western, which it probably is, I loved that. But Unforgiven is I would say non-traditional in that sense, or at least it was when it came out. I feel like
Yep.
when it came out, it was really everybody talked about how different it was, and I agree. Great movie, definitely worth seeing if you haven't seen it. I consider it a classic. I do feel like Clint Eastwood never played a different character again, and he probably was in 100 more movies, but it was always pretty much that character. Because you're right, he hit it right on the head. But I think he realized he was like, I'm going to do this in like every different possible setting I could possibly think of.
Yeah. But it was, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Gene Hackman was in it, as well as Morgan Freeman, and there's some other great actors as well.
That takes us to post facto.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake.
This is a segment where if we've made mistakes in earlier episodes or need to explain or elaborate or provide additional information, we get a chance to do it. So, Chris, do you have anything for post facto?
I'm going to keep my streak going and say that I don't. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter.
I didn't hear you make any mistakes anytime recently. And I didn't actually make a mistake in the last episode, but I did want to at least give credit where credit was due. We were in the last episode, we were talking about making the podcast, and in particular, you asked a couple questions about sound effects and where I found those. And I couldn't think of the name of the site that I've used mostly when looking for things like applause or little musical bites or booing or whatever it might be. There's a really good website called freesound.org, www.freesound.org, and then also one called soundstripe.com. Those are two that I've used in the past, and I felt like I needed to give credit to them. So that's all I have for post facto.
Nice. That's about as clean as we have it, other than
Yeah.
all my mumblings and stumblings with my words, but those aren't technically post factos. That's a quality. So it's a feature. It's a feature of my style.
It's a feature, not a bug.
All right. And that is going to bring us to staff picks.
Random, just around the corner from you.
So staff picks is Tom and I's attempt to recreate the list of recommendations from staff at either a music store or a video store, DVD store, and Tom and I use this quite a bit, especially at the record store. I found some of the best albums that I've had just by going off of someone's pick and thinking that the album cover was cool. So we're going to try the same thing, trying to focus on recent releases in any of the various forms of culture that we focus on in the show.
Yeah, so my staff pick for this episode is a book. It's a book that I am 95% done with. I received from my kids for Christmas the novel The Ministry of Time, written by Kayleigh Bradley. It was published on May 7th of 2024, so it is brand new out. It is, I guess the best way to describe it would be it's a time travel romance. It's kind of an action-y feel to it. The gist of, the premise of the book is that it's set in London, in England in general, and the premise is that the English government has figured out how to time travel. They've gone back in time and pulled out people from different time periods, generally people who were just about to die, so that nobody would notice their disappearance or that it wouldn't affect the time stream, so to speak. And the idea is they're bringing them and observing them. They're in the early stages of all this. They're trying to figure out if there are any ill effects and whether it's going to affect the person who was pulled from time or affect the present. But there are some twists. And I think there's a twist. Well, one of the twists I just came across, I think there may be a little bit more, but I haven't quite finished the novel. But I have to recommend it. Kayleigh Bradley, I've never read anything she's written. I don't know even if this is her first novel for that matter, but it's excellent. And the characters are very interesting. Like I said, there's a kind of a romantic side to all of it, as the main character is what they call a bridge. She's a person who was trained to acclimate these time travelers to the current time. And they live together and they try to teach them about things like cell phones and bus service and, all that kind of stuff. And it's just really well done. You really connect with all of the characters. There are about half a dozen main characters that and I haven't finished it. I can't imagine that the final 10 pages is going to change my opinion, but I'm looking forward to getting to the end. I tried to finish it last night and I fell asleep. So that just goes from being too old. But I recommend The Ministry of Time by Kayleigh Bradley. I would go out and grab it as soon as you can.
This is like the perfect choice for our show, because both of us have done this where we've made recommendations where we haven't finished, which is like of the moment, like in the moment recommendations.
Yes.
Which I think is great. And then the other one is that you tried to finish it and you fell asleep. So like
Yeah.
I was watching the horrible Rams Vikings game last night, and I purposely fell asleep, but I was going to fall asleep no matter what. It was just a bad game. And I'm like, I can't stay up for this shit. So
that sounds really familiar.
yeah. All right. So my staff pick for this week is by a band out of Maine, which is another theme that I'm starting to see. This is the second band that I've glommed onto that is from that state. The first was the Ghost of Paul Revere. The second is the Mallet Brothers Band, and I am going with a brand new release of theirs called Nothing's Working. And it's basically about a guy who's trying everything possible, which includes alcohol and weed, to forget the woman that he loves. And the song is called Nothing's Working, because he's trying to run away, to go up to the mountains and try different forms of meditation, I think. I know for sure he talks about marijuana, alcohol, everything he can to forget this woman, and nothing's working. It's an upbeat song. It's a fun song. And I want to highlight something that I guess makes me feel old. It references Adderall. And I've noticed that, like, at the current time, 3 songs that are in my regular playlist, let's say my top 10 of songs that I play over and over again. Yeah, old 60s song. Fuck, why can't I forget the name of that song? You told me not to run. I'd still standing next to you. References cigarettes and Adderall. Flatline Calvary, which I recommended as a staff pick in the last episode. Their song Missing You references pack of Marlboro Lights and Adderall. And then this song references taking Adderall and all of them other pills. So I feel like I'm missing out on something, because that seems to be the choice of drugs at least for songs. I don't even know what Adderall is, but it's referenced in this song, which, as I said, is a fun one. There's a couple other really nice songs they have. They have one called I Don't Mind the Morning. It's again about love, and obviously hates getting up early, but he's so in love he doesn't mind getting up, waking up to the woman in his bed. So the band is the Mallet Brothers Band. They've been around for a while, so I'm not sure if they're up and coming. They don't have a lot of followers on YouTube Music. They're not quite an unknown, but they are my staff pick for this week.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm looking forward to listening to that and taking some Adderall.
Yeah, let me know how that goes because I'm curious.
What's next?
I think what's next is the core of our show, which is the playlist picks. So Tom and I do a playlist for each season of Third Song In. We're in season 6. We each make a recommendation to add to the playlist. Ideally, it should match the theme of the show, and we try not to be overly obvious with our choices. You can find our playlist on all the various streaming services, YouTube Music, Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music. Search for Third Song In playlist, season, whatever, and we have them all the way back to season 1, and we also have a couple special playlists. So, Tom, what do you got for the second song from each of us on the season 6 playlist?
So my song for the playlist is Mysterious Ways by U2 from the album Achtung Baby in 1991. I was trying to pick a song that was from an album before a group jumped the shark. That was my approach to all of this. I'm not sure I did it perfectly. We discussed U2 jumping the shark when they did the album that was in conjunction with the release of the iPod, and that was the album Songs of Innocence, which I think came out in 2014. And frankly, for me, I think they jumped the shark before that. Achtung Baby may be the last U2 album I liked from start to finish. And I very, very much like that particular song, Mysterious Ways. They became very experimental, I think, after Mysterious Ways came out, after Achtung Baby came out. I wasn't a big fan of Zooropa or Pop. I felt like they were, and I give them credit, I think they were trying to stretch and do interesting things. And it all kind of eventually led to this business arrangement they had with Apple with Songs of Innocence. But I would say Achtung Baby, for me, was the last full album they made before I felt like they were on the way to jumping the shark anyway. So for this song on the playlist, I'm picking Mysterious Ways by U2 from 1991.
And I like your thought process on that because it doesn't make a lot of sense to choose a song that represents a band jumping the shark.
Right, that you didn't like.
Yeah, I didn't really like. It's like I could do like a rock from Seeger.
Right.
And I agree with your logic because I think you might see them trending in the wrong direction with some of that experimental music, at least for you. But that Apple thing really is like, all right, I'm done. Or as a listener, you are. So I think it's a good choice.
Yeah, it's probably when I stopped buying albums, actually. I still kept, I have Zooropa. I bought it when it came out. I bought their experimental stuff. I just didn't like it as much.
Yeah. And I went with much, much better music than you did. So I went with the band. And I didn't end up talking about this earlier. I was going to, because I'm intrigued by a genre of music jumping the shark. And what I listened to when Tom and I were roommates, and I still feel bad for him, was hair metal. And I listened to heavier stuff early on and then transitioned to more of the hair metal stuff, which he was always good. He would tell me he'd hate it, but he let us play stuff in the room without punching me out.
It was good to drink too.
It was good to drink too, because we could make fun of it. But I went with one of my favorite bands, and to me, they exemplify everything that was wrong about that movement. So Y&T out of San Francisco was a hard rockin', blue collar type of rock band earlier in their career. They were well known for putting on fantastic live shows. And in order to keep up when, the Poisons and Rat and Bon Jovi, let's be fair, all those bands with lead singers and artists who had the long flowing hair, they had to change their style and their sound. And I was going to go with a song that's near and dear to Tom and my heart, which is Your Mama Don't Dance. They did a remake of that song, which I did with a bunch of guys from my fraternity in an air band contest. But instead, because I think it's actually a decent interpretation, that was one of the things that happened with hair metal, is bands weren't writing their own stuff. They were making remakes of songs, and some of them were horrendous. This one wasn't so bad, I don't think. So I went instead with Summertime Girls, which is a very catchy, very fun song, but it's not Y&T. It's poppy and shallow. Even like the drums sound like they're synthetic in certain parts. It's not a hard rocking song. And to me, as a 1985, it was a single that was then added on to the end of a live album called Open Fire. And it was a bit of a hit for them, I think. So it achieved what they were, I assume, were hoping to accomplish, or at least what their record labels hoping to accomplish. But to me, it marked a really bad point for them. And everything that was wrong with hair metal is it started to become popular, and everything became poppy and sappy and crappy. It was just bad, bad music. And I still like the song enough to put it on the playlist, but it is definitely a sign of where Y&T had jumped the shark.
Cool. I certainly remember that song. I remember drinking and listening to that song and singing along with it as far as that goes.
Yes, because it was catchy, that's for sure.
It was very catchy for sure. That brings us to the end of the episode. Third Song In is recorded in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Joliet, Illinois. You can email us and tell us about your thoughts with respect to shows jumping the shark or bands or entire genres at thirdsongin@gmail.com. Follow us, rate and review our podcast wherever you listen, and give us all of your stars. You can also find our playlists on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and YouTube Music. You can follow those as well. Download them, share them, please.
We also want to get the word out about our website, thirdsonginpodcast.com. You can find all the recommendations, staff picks, unknown unknowns from this episode and previous episodes. You can also go there and link directly to the blogs that Tom and I put out every week. We release them on Thursdays, and all the ones that we've done thus far are on the website. So we ask you to check that out too.
Yep, we also have a Facebook page. You can find links to various episodes. You can find links and pictures and videos that relate to our episodes, as well as the guests on our episodes. You can now also find our blog on Substack. Please look for it there. You can subscribe to our Third Song In blog on that platform as well.
You've been listening to Third Song In with Chris Derrickson and Tom Polachek. Thanks for listening. All right, I'll give it a shot.
All right, go.
So I remember let's start over.
Yeah, no, I think that works.
That was like 3 words.
But it sounded like so many more.
It did.
I'm going to cut all of that out and just say this. And that brings us to, fuck me, just fucking punch me in the face. I've confused myself so much.